The old municipal library didn't just have a front door. It had a set of heavy, carved oak things that seemed to sigh whenever someone pushed them open, as if lamenting the disturbance. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, a young woman was the cause of the sigh. She slipped inside, letting the door close behind her with a soft, final thud that sealed out the noise of the city and wrapped her in a blanket of quiet. The air inside was different. It was cool and still, thick with the scent of aging paper, lemon-scented polish, and the faint, earthy smell of dust that had been settling for decades. Sunlight, the color of pale honey, fought its way through tall, grimy windows, casting long, lazy beams that illuminated a million tiny, dancing dust motes. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where you could almost hear the seconds ticking past like soft footfalls on a plush carpet. For the young woman, it felt like stepping into a cathedral built not for God but for stories. She was 24, though she carried herself with a gentle sort of composure that made her seem both younger and older than her years. She had a sweet, open face, framed by soft brown hair that she'd pulled back loosely, allowing a few strands to escape and curl around her temples. Her eyes, a warm shade of hazel, were taking everything in, not with the hurried glance of a tourist, but with the quiet appreciation of someone returning to a familiar, if forgotten, landscape. She wore a simple summer dress, the kind with small blue flowers on a white background, a plain canvas bag slung over one shoulder. She wasn't here for the books. Her gaze swept past the towering shelves, past the scattered patrons hunched over tables, their faces illuminated by the green glow of reading lamps. She was looking for something else. Her search, in a way, had started 2 years ago, not in a library, but in a quiet, sun-drenched living room on the day her grandmother passed away. That was the day the music in her world had stopped. Her grandmother hadn't just been a relative. She had been her first and only music teacher. She hadn't taught with strict scales and tedious metronomes. She had taught by feeling, by letting the small girl sit on her lap and feel the vibration of the strings through the wood. "Music, my love," she used to say, her voice as soft as cashmere, "is just feelings you can hear." The heart of their shared world had been a baby grand piano, an instrument that wasn't new or expensive, but was loved with the devotion usually reserved for a member of the family. It had a few nicks and scratches, a small water ring on its side from a forgotten teacup, and a warmth that seemed to radiate from its very soul. That was the piano where the young woman had learned to play, where her fingers had grown from clumsy and small to nimble and sure, guided by a patient, wrinkled hand resting lightly on her shoulder. After her grandmother was gone, the house felt too big, too quiet. Grief is a messy, confusing thing, and her family, lost in their own sorrow, had made a practical decision. They sold the piano. For the young woman, it was like a second funeral. The instrument, the keeper of so many happy memories, was simply taken away, loaded onto a truck, and vanished. For 2 years she lived with that quiet ache. But then, one rainy evening, she found a faded receipt in an old cookbook. It was from an antique dealer. A name, an address. That was all it took. Her quiet quest began. She became a detective of forgotten things, calling shops, searching online databases, sending emails, and following leads that often went cold. She traced the piano's journey from the antique dealer to a small hotel lobby, and then, finally, to this library, which had purchased it years ago as a decorative piece. A touch of class that no one ever played, and now here she was. Her eyes scanned the grand, echoing space of the atrium, and then she saw it. There, in the center of it all, basking in a patch of dusty sunlight, was the elephant in the room. It was a baby grand, the same elegant shape she remembered, but time and neglect had not been kind to it. The once shiny black lacquer was now a dull matte gray, crazed with a fine web of cracks that made it look like a dried-up riverbed. One of the legs had a nasty-looking chip near the floor, and the brass pedals were tarnished and green. It looked tired, wounded, as if it had simply given up and decided to sleep where it stood. To the people walking by, the student with headphones nodding to a beat only he could hear, the librarian pushing a heavy cart, the couple whispering to each other over a map it was just another piece of oversized furniture, piece of junk too heavy to move. But to her, it was a long-lost friend. It was the keeper of every lullaby, every clumsy attempt at a new song, every burst of happy, triumphant music she and her grandmother had ever made. Her heart gave a painful little lurch. It looked so much worse than she had imagined. It looked broken beyond repair, not just physically, but spiritually. She could almost hear the silence coming from it, a deep and profound quiet that was louder than any noise. She stood there for a long moment, just watching it from across the room, letting the ache of seeing it so old and uncared for wash over her. The library hummed on around her, oblivious. A phone buzzed. A book was dropped. The clock on the wall ticked. But none of it mattered. Her world had shrunk to the space between her and that sleeping piano. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, she started to walk towards it. Her soft-soled flats made no sound on the worn marble floor. She passed a table where a man was intently scribbling in a notebook. She passed a shelf of biographies, the stern faces of long-dead presidents and authors staring down at her. They were all just background blurs. She had eyes only for one thing. As she got closer, the details became more heartbreaking. She could see the chips on the ivory keys, some so badly worn that the dark wood beneath showed through. She could see the fine layer of gray dust that coated the entire surface, like a shroud. It was no longer the warm, vibrant center of a home. It was a monument to neglect. Her hand, which had been resting on the strap of her bag, trembled slightly. She stopped a few feet away, as if afraid to get too close, afraid that her presence might somehow shatter what was left of it. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside, tucked behind a clear plastic sleeve, was a photograph. It was a faded, slightly creased picture of her grandmother, sitting on that very piano bench, turned towards the camera with a smile that reached her kind eyes. In the photo, her hand rested on the keys as if she had paused mid-song just to say hello to the world. The young woman held the photograph in both hands, her thumb gently tracing the outline of her grandmother's face. She remembered the feeling of that hand on her own, the way it could guide and correct without ever making her feel like she was doing it wrong. She remembered the scent of her grandmother's rose-scented lotion, the sound of her humming softly as she played. A lump formed in her throat. She wasn't just looking at a broken piano. She was looking at the physical embodiment of her most cherished memories, and it was sitting here, in the middle of this public space, lonely and forgotten. It felt wrong. It felt like a profound injustice. But beneath the sadness, another feeling began to stir. It was a tiny, stubborn flicker of determination. This was not how it was supposed to end. Her grandmother had taught her that music wasn't about perfection. It was about the story you had to tell, the feelings you had to share. And this piano, her piano, still had a story to tell. It was just waiting for someone who knew how to listen. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air of the old library filling her lungs. She carefully put the photograph away, tucking her grandmother's smile safely back in her bag. Then, she took the final few steps. She was standing right beside it now, close enough to see the intricate grain of the wood beneath the cracked lacquer, close enough to feel its quiet, lonely energy. The grand, broken piano sat waiting. And for the first time in 2 very long years, the young woman felt like she was finally home. The young woman didn't touch the piano right away. She just stood there, a quiet, solitary figure beside the sleeping giant, as if waiting for it to wake up on its own. Her stillness was a strange thing in the middle of the atrium, a place that was all about quiet but purposeful movement. People walked with destinations in mind, even if their journey was just from the front door to the checkout desk. They had a goal. Her goal, it seemed, was simply to be there, to share the space with the forgotten instrument. But stillness attracts attention, especially when it's centered on something so deliberately ignored. The first person to notice her was a young man in his late teens, probably a student from the nearby university. He was slouched in one of the uncomfortable-looking wooden chairs, scrolling through his phone with the practiced thumb flick of someone who had spent a lifetime consuming information in tiny. He'd glanced up at the piano a dozen times, seeing only a piece of old junk. But now, there was a person there. A pretty girl in a simple dress, just staring at it. He sat up a little, a flicker of interest crossing his bored face. He nudged his friend, who was dozing with his head tilted back against the wall. "Hey, check it out," he whispered, nodding his chin in the young woman's direction. His friend blinked, rubbed his eyes, and followed his gaze. A slow, sleepy grin spread across his face. "No way," the friend mouthed back, his voice a dry rustle. "Is she about to play that thing?" The very idea was absurd. It was like watching someone about to dive into a dry swimming pool, or try to fly by flapping their arms. It was a guaranteed disaster, and that was always worth watching. The first young man, whose name was something ordinary that he felt didn't suit him, pulled out his own phone. The camera was faster than the message app. He angled the screen, making sure to capture both the girl and the sorry state of the piano in the same frame. This was gold. This was content. He could already picture the title, "Piano Girl Thinks She Can Play Wreck of Instrument Cringe." His thumb hovered over the record button, a hunter waiting for the perfect moment. The small gathering of two quickly attracted more curious onlookers. A couple in their 40s, dressed in smart, office casual clothes, were on their way to get a coffee from the small stand in the corner. They saw the small knot of students, their faces alight with the kind of mean-spirited delight that comes from watching someone else's potential failure. "What's going on?" the woman asked her husband, her voice a low conspiratorial whisper. He squinted. "Looks like someone's about to make a fool of themselves," he said, a cynical little smile playing on his lips. They stopped, their coffee run temporarily forgotten. It was always more fun to watch a train wreck than to get coffee. A tourist couple, clutching a city map, drifted over. They didn't understand the language, but they understood the universal body language of a crowd gathering for a spectacle. The woman adjusted her camera, thinking this might be some kind of quirky local performance art piece. Something to show the folks back home. The whispers grew into a low, rolling murmur that filled the space around the piano. It was a sound made up of quiet laughter, judgmental sighs, and excited little gasps. "She can't be serious. Those keys are probably stuck. It's going to sound like a cat in a blender." The young woman heard the sounds. She was acutely aware of the shift in the atmosphere around her. The air, which had felt so neutral and full of potential just moments ago, now felt thick and heavy with expectation. It was the wrong kind of expectation. It was the kind people reserve for a gladiator entering an arena filled with lions. They weren't there to cheer for her. They were there to see her get torn apart. For a moment, a hot wave of self-consciousness washed over her. Her cheeks felt warm. She imagined how she must look to them. A naive, dreamy girl standing before a pile of splintered wood and rusted strings, about to make a complete and utter fool of herself. She could almost hear their thoughts, their dismissive, cynical little comments. The temptation to just turn and walk away was immense. It would be so easy. She could just melt back into the stacks, become just another faceless patron, and leave the piano to its silent, dusty sleep. No one would think twice about it. They would laugh for a moment, forget her, and move on. But then she closed her eyes for just a second, and she saw her grandmother's face, the photograph still fresh in her mind. She heard her voice, not in words, but in a feeling. A feeling of unwavering belief, of pure, simple love. She remembered her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and soft, dancing over the keys of that very same piano, making it sing even when it was slightly out of tune. This wasn't about them. This had never been about them. Taking a small, quiet breath that no one else could hear, the young woman made her decision. She let their sounds, their energy, wash over her, and then flow past, like a river flowing around a stone. She was the stone. She was steady. She reached into her canvas bag again. This time, she pulled out the photograph. She handled it with a tenderness that was almost reverent, her fingers tracing the worn edges. Then, she carefully leaned forward and propped it up against the frame of the music rest. The little window for sheet music was empty, of course, but now it held something far more important. It held a memory. It held her reason. There, for the whole crowd to see, was the smiling face of the woman who had given this piano its soul. It was a silent declaration, a quiet act of defiance. She wasn't just a random girl. She was a granddaughter. And this wasn't just a broken instrument. It was an heirloom. The gesture, however, was completely misinterpreted by the crowd. "Oh, she's brought a picture of her boyfriend." "How cute!" one of the students snickered. "This just gets better and better." The young man with the phone finally hit record. The little red light blinked on, a tiny watchful eye capturing every detail. The crowd seemed to lean in as one, their phones held up like a bouquet of digital flowers, all pointed towards her. This was the moment. The pre-show was over. The main event was about to begin. The young woman finally reached out a hand. She didn't go for the keys. She ran her fingers gently along the dusty lid, a soft, caressing motion, as if she were smoothing the hair of a sleeping child. Her touch was so gentle, so full of affection, that for a brief, baffling second, a few people in the crowd felt a pang of confusion. That wasn't the body language of a performer about to fail. It was the body language of someone saying goodbye, or hello, or both. Then, she moved to the side and found the ornately carved bench that went with the piano. It was as dusty and neglected as the instrument itself. She didn't wipe it down. She simply sat down, her posture straight but not stiff. She was there to play, not to pose for a portrait. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, took another deep breath, and then looked up. She scanned the faces before her for the first time. She saw the smirks, the raised eyebrows, the phones, the looks of pure, unadulterated curiosity. She saw everything, and she acknowledged none of it. Her gaze drifted past them, as if they were merely ghosts in the room, and settled once more on the piano, on the smiling face in the photograph. She turned her body slightly, positioning herself just right, as if her grandmother had been right there coaching her. The laughter swelled to its peak. It wasn't cruel laughter, not really. It was the easy, thoughtless laughter of a crowd that judges everything by its cover, finds joy in the spectacle of failure. It was the sound of people who were certain they knew what was coming next. They were so certain. The young woman gently placed her hands in her lap. Then, with the unhurried grace of a dancer, she lifted the heavy lid that covered the keys. It made a soft groaning sound, a sigh of protest from being disturbed after so long. As it opened, it revealed the full extent of the damage. Yellowed, dusty keys. Gaps where ivory had fallen away. The tangled, dusty mess of hammers and strings inside. It was a mess. It was hopeless. The young man with the phone zoomed in, his finger hovering over the button to post the clip. He couldn't wait. This was going to be hilarious. And then, she raised her hands. The atrium fell silent. Everyone, from the cynical students to the confused tourists, held their breath. This was it. The moment of disaster? The moment they had all been waiting for. The silence that fell over the atrium was a strange and heavy thing. It wasn't a respectful silence, the kind you might find in a concert hall just before a performance begins. This was a tense, electric silence, the quiet that comes just before a punchline or a crash. It was the sound of a crowd collectively holding its breath, their anticipation so thick it felt like a physical presence in the dusty air. Every eye was on the young woman, every phone was angled, every cynical thought was poised and ready. In their minds, the story was already written. The first note would be a disaster, a discordant thud, a dead thump. A pathetic little plink that would shatter the moment and justify their laughter. The young man who was recording felt his heart beat a little faster with excitement. He was about to capture internet gold. He could almost feel the likes and shares already rolling in. The businessman in the front shifted his weight, a smirk of superiority on his face. He knew quality, and this was the definition of amateur hour. He was prepared to wince, to share a knowing glance with his wife. The young woman, however, was in a different world. The faces, the phones, the silent, jeering crowd, they all faded into the background. In her mind, the atrium dissolved. The grimy windows, the towering shelves of books, the people, everything vanished. There was only her and the piano and the memory that sat smiling on the music rest. She could almost feel the warmth of her grandmother's hand on her shoulder, a comforting weight that had been missing for 2 long years. She heard her voice, not as a sound, but as a feeling deep inside her. Music, my love, doesn't come from a perfect instrument. It comes from a perfect feeling. It was the most important lesson her grandmother had ever taught her. It wasn't about hitting the right notes. It was about telling the truth. The young woman's hands, which had been resting in her lap, began to rise. They moved slowly, with a deliberate grace that seemed to contradict the chaotic scene around her. They were not the hands of a nervous amateur preparing for a fumble. They were the hands of a surgeon about to begin a delicate operation, or an artist about to make the first stroke on a blank canvas. She didn't look at the keys. She didn't need to. She knew this keyboard like she knew her own name. Every dip and curve, every rough patch where an ivory key had once been. Her fingers, long and slender, hovered over the worn, yellowed surface. For a moment, they seemed to float there, a breath away from the strings, suspended in time. The crowd leaned in even further. A single, unified organism drawn to the inevitable point of failure. This was it, the apex of their collective amusement. She chose one key. It was a lonely white key, situated near the center of the keyboard, one that seemed to have endured the least amount of abuse. With a motion that was both firm and incredibly gentle, she pressed it down. What came out of the piano was not the sound of failure. It was not the sound of a broken, sad instrument giving up the ghost. The sound that emerged from the dusty, cracked wood was a single, clear, and astonishingly pure note. It was a low, resonant tone, so full and rich that it seemed to fill the entire cavernous space of the atrium. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. It hung in the air, solid and real, cutting through the haze of dust and doubt like a ray of light breaking through clouds. It was a note that didn't sound broken. It sounded wise. It sounded like it had been waiting a very long time to be heard. In that one perfect second, the entire world of the atrium shifted on its axis. The anticipated crash, the expected disaster, it never came. Instead, there was clarity. The crowd's collective cynical expectation was shattered, not by a loud noise, but by a profound and unexpected beauty. The young man recording felt his thumb freeze over the screen. The smirk on his face evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. This was not a fail video. This was something else. Something he couldn't name. The businessman's cynical smile melted away. His jaw went slightly slack. The note he heard wasn't amateurish. It was professional. It was the kind of sound you'd expect to hear from a world-class concert instrument in a perfectly tuned hall, not from this museum piece of a piano. He felt a strange sensation, a flicker of something that felt suspiciously like awe. The whispers died in the throats of the students. The laughter that had been bubbling just beneath the surface was extinguished completely. Every mocking thought, every derisive comment, was silenced by that one perfect note. It was as if the piano itself had spoken, and in its clear, resonant voice, it had told them all to be quiet. To listen, the young woman didn't seem to notice the change. Her eyes were still closed, her entire being focused on the connection between her fingers and the strings. From that single foundational note, a melody began to bloom. She didn't launch into a complicated, showy piece. That would have been foolish. A battle the old piano could not win. Instead, she began to play a simple, haunting melody. It was a lullaby, one that most of the people in the crowd had never heard before. But that felt as familiar as their own heartbeat. It was a song full of gentle swaying motions, of soft whispers and quiet promises. Her fingers moved with an intuitive, fluid grace. They knew the piano's secrets. They knew which keys would respond with a clear tone and which would fight back. When her finger came to a key that was chipped and rough, she would play it with a touch that was somehow both softer and more deliberate, as if acknowledging its pain. When she encountered a key that was missing entirely, she didn't stop. She created a pause, a tiny breath of silence that made the next note feel even more precious. The imperfections of the piano, the very things the crowd had been laughing at, became part of the music. The slight out-of-tuneness of the strings gave the lullaby a raw, soulful, almost folk-like quality. It wasn't a flawless, sterile performance you'd hear on a recording. It was a human performance. It was a conversation. The young woman was not just playing the piano. She was listening to it, and it was speaking back to her. Each cracked key, each muted string seemed to contribute its own unique voice to the story. The song was no longer just a collection of notes. It was a narrative about resilience, about finding beauty in broken places, about the enduring power of a memory. The crowd, now utterly captivated, began to change. The wall of cynical observers dissolved. They were no longer a group of separate individuals judging a spectacle. They had become an audience, united by a shared, powerful experience. The businessman who had been so ready to dismiss the performance now stood completely still, his briefcase hanging forgotten from his hand. He wasn't just hearing a song anymore. He was being transported. The lullaby reminded him of his own grandmother, of stories she used to tell him, of a time in his life that was simpler and more innocent. He felt a sudden, surprising tightness in his chest. The young woman who had been dabbing at her eyes was no longer just crying. She was letting the tears fall, her face turned up as if to receive the music. The melody was a balm, speaking directly to a sadness in her own life that she had never been able to name. The young man with the phone had completely forgotten he was recording. His arm had lowered slightly, the phone no longer a weapon to capture failure, but a vessel to hold a moment of unexpected beauty. He was mesmerized, watching the way the young woman's hands moved, the serene expression on her face. He realized, with a jolt of something like shame, that he had almost missed this. He had been so focused on the potential for disaster that he had nearly closed himself off to the possibility of magic. Even the students, who had been the ringleaders of the laughter, were transformed. Their smug smiles were gone, replaced by expressions of genuine wonder and respect. They were seeing something they hadn't expected to see: courage. Not the loud, boisterous kind of courage, but a quiet, unshakable kind. The courage to sit down in front of a broken instrument in a mocking crowd and create something beautiful anyway. The melody continued to weave its spell. It flowed through the atrium, wrapping itself around the dusty shelves and the sleepy patrons. It filled every corner, chasing away the shadows and the cynicism. It was a testament to the idea that you don't need a perfect instrument to make perfect music. You don't need a perfect stage to share a perfect feeling. You only need a heart that is true and a story that needs to be told. And the young woman, with her eyes closed and her hands dancing across the wounded keys, was telling the most beautiful story of all. The lullaby didn't just fill the air. It seemed to change its very composition. The dust motes, which had been dancing chaotically in the sunbeams, now appeared to move in a slow, graceful waltz. As if choreographed by the music itself, the silence that had once been thick with anticipation was now a different kind of silence, a sacred shared stillness. It was the silence you get in a forest after a light rain, when everything is clean and fresh and the world feels renewed. The young woman's fingers continued their journey across the keyboard, but they weren't just playing notes anymore. They were telling a story, and the broken piano was their storyteller. The melody, which had begun as a simple, gentle tune, began to unfold into something more complex, more layered. It was like watching a single thread of yarn being used to weave an entire tapestry. She introduced a new phrase in the melody, a slightly sadder, more longing part of the song. Her left hand, which had been providing a simple, steady foundation, began to move with more purpose. It reached down into the lower registers of the piano, the section where the strings were thickest and the wood was oldest. These keys, the ones that looked the most weary, responded not with a groan, but with a deep, sonorous hum. It was a sound that felt ancient, like the echo of a bell from a forgotten church. It was the voice of memory itself. This deeper, more sorrowful part of the melody resonated with the crowd in a way the joyful beginning had not. The businessman, whose own mind had been drifting to his grandmother, felt the music pluck at a specific tender string of his own memory. He remembered her funeral, the heavy silence in the house afterward, the way the world had seemed to lose its color for a while. The music didn't just remind him of her. It put him back in that moment, but it did so with a strange sense of comfort. The sadness wasn't being ignored. It was being honored. It was being given a voice. He looked at the young woman, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the serene expression on her face, the slight, almost imperceptible sway of her body with the rhythm. He understood then that this wasn't a performance for an audience. This was a ritual, a prayer. The young man who was recording felt a shift in his own chest, a sensation he wasn't used to. He was a child of the internet, a connoisseur of quick cuts, loud noises, and fleeting jokes. He consumed content. He didn't contemplate it. But this music was forcing him to slow down, to feel something deeper than the fleeting thrill of a viral video. He watched the way her right hand, the hand playing the melody, occasionally seemed to pause over one of the missing keys. The pause wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate space in the music, a moment of quiet that spoke louder than any note could. It was a breath, a heartbeat of silence that made the sound that followed it feel infinitely more precious. He found himself holding his own breath during those pauses, feeling the tension and the release as if he were the one playing. For the first time, he looked past the young woman and saw the photograph propped up against the music rest. He saw the kind, smiling face of the older woman. And suddenly, it all made sense. This wasn't a random act of artistic quirkiness. This was a conversation, a dialogue across time. He was witnessing something deeply personal, a love letter set to music. The camera in his hand felt heavier now, more significant. He was no longer just a spectator. He was an archivist, tasked with preserving a moment of pure, unscripted magic. The students, too, were completely under the spell. Their world was one of constant distraction, endless streams of information and entertainment designed to be consumed and forgotten in an instant. They had never experienced anything like this. This music demanded their full attention. It didn't have a beat you could dance to or lyrics you could sing along to. It just was. It was a current, and they were being pulled along by it. One of them, the one who had first nudged his friend, had a sudden, startling thought. He thought about his own grandfather, who had passed away last year. He remembered the old man's workshop, the smell of sawdust and varnish, the meticulous way he would carve little wooden birds. He remembered feeling a pang of regret that he had never really taken the time to learn the craft, to connect with his grandfather on that level. As he watched the young woman pour her heart into the broken piano, he felt a sharp, poignant regret for all the things he had taken for granted. All the stories he had never bothered to learn. The music was doing more than just sounding beautiful. It was acting as a key, unlocking doors in the minds and hearts of everyone who heard it. The song began to evolve again. The sad, longing melody started to weave its way back toward the joyful, simpler theme from the beginning. It was like watching the sun come out after a long, gentle rain. The notes began to climb higher, lighter, full of a quiet sense of hope and resilience. She wasn't erasing the sadness. She was integrating it. She was showing that joy and sorrow were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin, both essential parts of a life lived fully. The young woman's playing became more confident, more assured. Her fingers flew across the keys, navigating the imperfections with an intuitive grace that was breathtaking to watch. She found a rhythm with the piano's quirks, turning a sticky key into a percussive accent, a dead note into a moment of dramatic pause. She and the piano were no longer just separate entities. They were one single breathing organism, telling a story of survival and love. The young woman with the camera was now crying freely, but she wasn't wiping her tears away. She let them stream down her face, her expression one of rapture. The music was speaking a language to her that went beyond words, a language of the soul that understood her own unspoken griefs and hopes. The businessman had put his briefcase down on the floor. He was no longer in a hurry. His coffee was getting cold. His meeting was in 20 minutes, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the music and the story it was telling. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the past that he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. The lullaby reached its final crescendo. It wasn't a loud, crashing finish. It was a swell of sound, a wave of emotion that rose up and seemed to hang in the air for a single, glorious moment, full of all the joy, sadness, love, and memory that had been poured into it. And then, as gently as it had begun, it started to fade. She played the final notes, one by one, each one a quiet, deliberate release. It was like watching a beautiful sunset, the colors slowly receding until there is only a soft, warm glow left in the sky. The last note she played was the same single, pure note she had started with. It hung in the air for a moment, a perfect, shimmering sphere of sound, and then it was gone. Silence returned to the atrium. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence was not empty. It was full. It was vibrating with the echo of the melody, heavy with the emotions the music had stirred. It was a peaceful, contemplative, and deeply reverent silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The young woman kept her eyes closed, her hands resting gently on the keys, as if they were holding onto the final note, not wanting to let it go. A single, gentle tear escaped from beneath her closed eyelid and traced a slow path down her cheek. She had not just played a song. She had shared a piece of her soul, and in doing so, had touched the souls of everyone who had been fortunate enough to listen. The broken piano, the laughing crowd, it was all gone now. There was only the music and the beautiful, healing silence that had left behind. The silence stretched on, becoming a living, breathing thing in the vast room. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence, a thick, reverent blanket woven from the last echoes of the melody. No one wanted to be the first to break it. To speak, to cough, to even shift too loudly on their feet would have been like shouting in a cathedral. The moment was too fragile, too sacred. The young woman sat motionless, her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes still closed. Her single tear had dried on her cheek, leaving a faint, invisible trail. She was not basking in the afterglow of a performance. She was saying goodbye. She was committing this feeling to memory, the feeling of her grandmother's presence. So strong it was as if she were sitting right there on the bench beside her. Their shoulders touching, their two souls wrapped up in the music. For 2 long years, she had carried a quiet ache, a space in her heart that could not be filled. And in those few minutes of playing, that space hadn't just been filled. It had overflowed. It was a moment of profound peace, and she was not ready to let it go. The crowd, a collection of strangers just moments before, was now a single, unified entity, bound by a shared, unspoken experience. The cynicism, the boredom, casual cruelty that had defined them when they arrived, it had all been washed away by the music, leaving behind something raw and tender. The young man who had been recording finally, slowly, lowered his phone. His thumb, which had been so eager to hit the share button, now felt clumsy and thick. The little red recording light was still on, but he didn't care. He wasn't thinking about views or likes. He was looking at the small, hunched figure of the young woman, and he felt a strange sense of protectiveness wash over him. He felt like he had been allowed into a secret, sacred space, and his responsibility now was not to expose it, but to honor it. He looked down at his screen, at the video he had captured. It wasn't a fail video. It was a miracle video. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would be sharing this, but not in the way he had planned. There would be no mocking title, no hashtag of shame. This was too important, too beautiful for that. This needed to be shared as a gift, a quiet reminder to a world that was often too loud and too cynical to listen. The businessman stood rooted to the spot, his meeting, his schedule, his entire world of appointments and responsibilities completely forgotten. The music had opened a door in his mind that he hadn't even known was there. He was thinking about his own father, a stoic, quiet man who had worked his whole life to provide for his family, a man he had loved but never really known. He had never taken the time to sit with him, to ask him about his dreams, to listen to his stories. Now his father was gone, and all those stories were gone with him. The young woman's music had been a powerful, poignant reminder of the time that had been lost. He felt a pang of regret so sharp it was almost a physical pain, but mixed with it was a powerful, urgent resolve. He looked at his wife, who had also been crying quietly, and he saw the same understanding in her eyes. They didn't need to speak. They both knew they had been given a second chance, a wake-up call delivered in the language of a simple lullaby. The students stood in a tight knot, their usual swagger and posturing completely gone. They looked at the young woman with a look of reverence that was almost comical given their initial amusement. The one who had been dozing off was now completely awake, his eyes wide with wonder. They were all thinking the same thing. They had almost missed it. They had been so close to dismissing something beautiful, to letting their own jadedness blind them to a moment of pure magic. They had learned a lesson that no lecture, no book, no parent could ever teach them, that the most incredible things in life often hide in plain sight. Behind a cracked and broken exterior, waiting for someone who was willing to look past the surface. The tourist couple stood apart, but they were just as captivated. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. The man slowly lowered his own expensive camera, piece of equipment designed to capture grand landscapes and famous landmarks. He knew, with a photographer's instinct, that the most profound image he had captured on this entire trip was not of a monument, but of the gentle, weeping profile of the young woman as she played. It was a portrait of pure, unadulterated emotion, a human story that transcended language and culture. After what felt like a small eternity, the young woman slowly opened her eyes. The world came back into focus. The dusty windows, the tall shelves, the faces. Oh, the faces. She saw them now, not as a jeering crowd, but as a collection of individuals. Their expressions a mirror of the emotions she had just poured into the music. She saw awe and respect and understanding. She saw tears on the cheeks of strangers. She saw a connection, and in that moment, she felt a sense of warmth spread through her chest. This was not her secret personal moment anymore. She had shared it, and in sharing it, had given a piece of it to everyone who had listened. With a soft sigh, she carefully lifted her hands from the keys. Her movement was slow and deliberate, as if she were afraid of breaking the spell. She reached out and gently lowered the lid over the keyboard, not with a bang, but with a soft, final click. It was like closing the cover of a beloved book after finishing the last chapter. The story was over. She then picked up the photograph of her grandmother, holding it for a moment in her hands before tucking it safely back into her canvas bag. Her small ritual was complete. She stood up from the bench, her movements as graceful and unhurried as they had been when she arrived. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't bow or acknowledge their applause, which had yet to even start. Her performance had not been for them. She ran her hand one last time over the dusty, cracked lid of the piano, a final gentle caress. It was a gesture of farewell, of thanks. Then she turned and began to walk away. She didn't hurry. She moved with a quiet dignity, her shoulders back, her steps light. She was a different person than the one who had walked into the library an hour ago. She was no longer just a young woman carrying the weight of a 2-year-old grief. She was a musician, a storyteller, a keeper of a memory. She had given her grandmother's music a voice again, and in doing so, had found her own. The silence was finally broken by the sound of one person clapping. It wasn't a loud, boisterous clap. It was a slow, hesitant, single clap that came from the back of the room. It was the sound of someone testing the waters, afraid of breaking the spell, but needing to offer something in return for the gift they had just received. That single clap was like a match struck in the dark. Another person joined in. Then another. It wasn't a wave of thunderous ovation that erupted. It was a slow, gentle, rolling tide of applause that grew organically, washing over the room. It was the most respectful, heartfelt applause any of them had ever been a part of. There were no whistles, no shouts of bravo. It was just the soft, rhythmic sound of palms meeting palms, a simple, human expression of gratitude and awe. The young woman didn't stop or turn around. She simply kept walking, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She could feel the warmth of their appreciation on her back, but the real applause she was hearing was the echo of the music in her heart. She walked past the shelves of books, past the stern-faced portraits on the walls, towards the heavy oak doors at the front of the library. The applause followed her, a soft, continuous sound, until she pushed her way through the sighing doors and stepped out into the bright, noisy afternoon. The city was a jarring contrast to the quiet sanctuary she had just left. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of people on the sidewalk, the wail of a distant siren had all rushed back in. But it didn't bother her. She felt a sense of peace that was unshakable. Inside the atrium, the applause finally faded. The crowd stood in place for a few moments longer, not wanting to leave, not wanting to let the magic of the moment go. They looked at each other, and for the first time, they weren't just strangers in a library. They were fellow travelers who had shared an incredible, unexpected journey. The businessman picked up his briefcase, looked at his wife, and squeezed her hand. "Let's go call your dad," he said softly. The young man who had been recording stood for a long time, just looking at the broken piano. It didn't look like a piece of junk to him anymore. It looked like a monument. He watched as a librarian cautiously approached the instrument, dusted the lid with a cloth, and placed a small handwritten sign on it. He walked closer to read it. The sign was simple, written in neat cursive on a piece of cardstock. It said, "This piano is not to be moved. Please be respectful." The young woman who had been crying approached him, a questioning look on her face. "Did you get it?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. He nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I got it," he said, "and I know exactly what to do with it." And in the center of the quiet atrium, the broken piano sat. It was just as cracked, just as dusty, just as imperfect as it had been an hour ago. But to the people who had been there to listen, it was no longer just a broken piano. It was a miracle. It was proof that beauty doesn't need to be perfect to be real. It was a reminder to listen. It was the echo of a lullaby, and it would never, ever be forgotten.